So, you've finally gotten your first top-tier jet, but you don't quite know how everything works just yet. Or you're a veteran player looking to pick something new. Then, this is the video for you. The series will cover a wide range of topics about all aspects of jet combat. I hope at the completion of the series everyone picks up a little something. Without further ado, our first topic is radars in War Thunder. With the arrival of supersonic jets in 1.85, it was immediately followed by the introduction of radar in 1.87 locked on. Since then, we've observed a significant growth in the radars in War Thunder. Not only have we progressed to pulse Dopplers and track-wheel scan radars, we've also incorporated radar systems on World War II aircraft like on the F-6, F-5FN, and the Dornier 217N. With this growth also grew the complexity of using radar systems. With the arrival of radar missiles, War Thunder has incorporated mechanics like radar cross-section, notching, and so much more. So, let's take a look at how radar works in War Thunder. Radar is an abbreviation for radio detection and ranging. From the name we can glean that radar has something to do with radio waves. Radars use emitted radio signals bouncing off objects to determine their locations, and, in the case of modern radar systems, even angle and velocity. Radar operate in sections called bands. At the risk of going too technical here, radar bands generally describe the wavelength and frequency of the radar. Most radar in top tier operate on the X band like the F4's ANAPQ-120 and the F4 EJ-Kai's ANAPG-66J. The X band is used because it's most suited for missile guidance. Radar in War Thunder is divided into two kinds: ground-based radar and airborne radar. Ground-based radar primarily found on SPAA but also exists in the Chrysanthema S in the USSR-3. Airborne radar in War Thunder is divided into four categories: search radar, tracking radar, radar gun sights, and multimode radars. Search radars are radars that detect aircraft but have no capability to track them actively. German World War II radars operated on this principle, along with some modern aircraft that have separate search radars, such as the F-3D-1, using the AN/APS-21 search radar and the AN/APS-26 tracking radar. Separate search and track radars also exist on SPAA. Some SPAA have the search radar and tracking radar included in one system. SPAA, like German SPAAs, use a different track radar from the SAG and PDR search radars that they use. Separate antennas used for search and track and SPAAs allow some of them to perform combined search, also known as track while scan. So, if you see your radar dish still rotating even if you are tracking an aircraft, that's combined search mode. This should also mean that unless the track and scan functions are relegated to one antenna like the ZSU-23-4 and VAC-40, you can track aircraft with the radar dish down, effectively becoming an M163 kind of SPAA. There are even SPAA like the PGZ-04A, ADATS, and Roland that use IR tracking instead of a tracking radar, so they don't generate an RWR response. In aircraft, this is combined into one system called the multimode radar. It can perform search and track on one antenna. However, since the search and track functions are combined, track while scan is difficult to achieve. We already have aircraft in-game that can perform track while scan, however, this feature is not yet implemented in-game. The EJ-Kai with its AN/APG-66J and the JA-37C and its PS-46A radar. We achieve this by processing the signal through a computer that remembers the original location of the target being tracked as the antenna swings elsewhere to detect other targets. The limitation of track while scan in such systems was the physical ability of the radar to swing side to side. This led to the advent of electronically scanned array radars that steer the radio waves in a certain direction instead of the antenna itself. This allows faster scanning in track while scan mode. Track while scan mode is also utilized by Fox 3 missiles like the AIM-54 and AIM-120, as they don't require the full power of the radar to guide itself to the target, only requiring occasional mid-course correction as opposed to the Sparrow that requires full tracking of the radar from launch until hit. This is overcome by electronically scanned array radars that produce multiple radar waves that keep track of the target while other waves scan the area or track other targets. Like track while scan, however, electronically scanned array radars are still a bit far from being added into the game. Radar gun sights are even simpler. It uses a small radar to continuously adjust the gun sight on the aircraft to the range of the target. It's almost useless in realistic mode and arcade as they are third-person mode primarily, but the adjustment of the gun sight is visible in cockpit mode. In War Thunder, the display of the radar is represented by the interface. There are three kinds of representation of the battlefield as seen by the radar in the game. The default one that everyone uses is the Plant Position Indicator or PPI. This is the cone-shaped representation of the battlefield representing the maximum scan of the radar, and it displays targets relative to the radar, which is at the very tip of the cone. The second is the C-scope, which is a wide rectangle representing the battlefield as how the radar sees it head-on, rather than top-down on the Plant Position Indicator. The MiG-23 MLD's IRST mode uses C-scan for its raster scan. And the final representation is the B-scope. An alternative to the PPI, it also displays a top-down view of the battlefield, which uses radar sweeps from left to right instead of a back-and-forth swinging in the PPI view. Along with the PPI, you can see at the bottom right the indicated search range of the radar. In some radars, this can be changed and is often not the maximum detection range of the radar. Sometimes switch my EJ Kai radar to the 35km setting just to spook the enemy team. Another adjustable parameter is the azimuth sweep and the elevation scan. You can search narrower in both the left and right sweep and the up and down sweep. Though there are preset choices and you cannot independently adjust azimuth and elevation. This can also be adjusting using the change radar search mode in the multi-mode menu. There are also power indicators for the radar, ground clutter indicator, which we'll discuss in a few. Targets detected by the radar show up as square blocks in the interface. If locked on, they are enclosed between two thin bars, and if the radar has IFF interrogators, it is underlined by a thin bar to denote a friendly. SPAA radars use wide blocks to determine aircraft, normal blocks for helicopter, and small blocks for missiles. There are various radar modes in War Thunder. There is the normal search and track mode. This uses the radar's base capabilities and detects targets without removing ground clutter. This is the default mode in most aircraft radars, except for the EJ Kai and J37C, whose default mode is their Pulse Doppler mode. Pulse Doppler or MTI mode then removes ground clutter but otherwise retains the same search and track capabilities. We will discuss how Pulse Doppler and MTI works in a few. These encompass the modes collectively called BVR mode in the multi-menu as they perform tracking and detection at beyond visual ranges as opposed to the ACM mode. An alternative way to the BVR scan mode is the ACM mode. ACM mode lets go of the wide scan and narrows its search to the effective bore sight of the aircraft, locking onto the first target it sees. This is the default tracking mode of the MiG-21 as it has no proper track mode. Some radars don't have ACM, such as the Cyrano Ibis and the Cyrano 2 of the Mirage 3C and Mirage 3E, respectively. An alternative to automatic locking is a feature called target cyclic switching of aircraft radar in the controls. By turning this off, you can prevent your radar from automatically choosing a suitable target among the detected targets in the scope. You can guide a cursor to the area where the preferred target is, and when the lock button is pressed, the radar will specifically track the target in the indicated area. The biggest problem of early airborne radar systems was ground return. As radars utilize radio wave reflection to detect and track aircraft, naturally radar waves that bounce off the ground would be received by the radar as well. With no way to determine between ground return and actual targets, radar at low altitude became very useless and flying low became a tactic of aircraft to avoid radar. This was most prevalent during the introduction of the Sparrows when MiG-21s and similar aircraft crept to the ground, a trait that USSR players carry to this day. You can tell ground clutter in War Thunder through two indicators. One is the small up and down arrow at the top of the plant position indicator, and a very bright white area on the radar. This limitation was studied by engineers that found that you could filter out ground clutter by processing the Doppler shift of reflected radar waves. A Doppler shift is a change in the frequency of a wave relative to the source. A closer source would have a higher frequency and a farther source would have a lower frequency. Pulse Doppler radars usually use the Pliston power amplifier to produce medium pulse repetition frequencies to allow range or velocity measurement, but not both. We'll get to this later. The introduction of pulse Doppler radars allowed look-down, shoot-down capability, but it's not the only way to get look-down or shoot-down capability. Another method exists and is called the Moving Target Indicator, or MTI. This is the mode used in the MiG-23 MLD and the Mirage F1C to allow look-down, shoot-down. Moving target indicators exist when the radar cannot fulfill the requirements of pulse Doppler signal processing. Most MTI radars cannot achieve medium pulse repetition frequencies, thus use low PRFs. Because of these limitations, MTI achieves look-down, shoot-down capability without the ranging and velocity capability of pulse Doppler. MTIs merely tell you the range of a target at up to 50 kilometers. Beyond that, it can no longer utilize direct ranging and must use ambiguous ranging, and pulse Doppler radars have range ambiguity resolution to determine true range. MTI also has a lower subclutter visibility, thus greatly reducing its range compared to pulse Dopplers. In War Thunder, the AN/APG-59, FDF-4J, FGR-2, and FG-1, as well as the derivative JAWG-12 on the T2 and F1, use velocity measurement to detect targets, while the EJ-Kai and JA-37C use range measurement to track targets. These two have different characteristics in-game. Velocity measurement cannot be chaff in-game because chaff loses speed quickly compared to the source aircraft, ultimately being ignored by the pulse Doppler signal processor. While range measurement radars can be chaffed, with the radar keeping lock but the radar missile tracking the chaff instead, as seen on this clip of me firing an RB-71 from a JE-37C. In the update Raining Fire, War Thunder introduced semi-active radar homing missiles, namely the Sparrow, R3R, and the R530. With the addition of these radar missiles, radar mechanics became more significant and nuanced. Gaijin introduced the concept of bad tracking in missiles, leading to the Sparrow syndrome that would launch the missile and it would detonate if the track failed. Why does this happen? Well, it has to do with the principle of semi-active radar homing missiles. In lieu of an infrared seeker and IR missiles, SAR-H missiles have a small receiver acting as its seeker. It uses reflection of the target made by the radar of the launch platform to guide itself to the target. Because of this dependency on reflected signals, many scenarios of poor tracking can occur. The most common would be the angle of the radar beam from the launch platform and the target is inappropriate to produce a reflection that the missile receiver can home in on. This happens on tail-on chases where the radar keeps locked but the missile cannot get a reflection. There's also the common issue of firing beyond the missile's lock range, which War Thunder doesn't allow because of the seeker mechanic they implemented on radar missiles. Of course, late Sparrows almost never encounter this issue because most engagements in War Thunder happen below 30 kilometers, and the lock range of the AIM-7F is 40 kilometers. It affects the Super 530F the most as the Serrano 4's maximum range is 28 kilometers, but the lock range is a whopping 12 kilometers. To sum it up, getting a radar lock doesn't automatically guarantee a missile lock, and knowing whether you have a missile that will track is now made significantly easier thanks to the seeker mechanic implemented about a year ago. Now, you know that if you only have one circle, the missile won't track, 1.5 circle, but won't go red means the track is bad, and 2 full circle means a good chance to kill the target. Then, there's the phenomenon of look-down, shoot-down on aircraft radars that did not have pulse Doppler capability. This usually confused players that suddenly realize their F4Es have Sparrows that track targets well below them. This is usually attributed to the significant difference between ground clutter altitude and the target altitude. Basically, the higher the launch platform is, the more capable it is in shooting down a target at lower altitudes. Even crazy locks like a direct downward looking lock, as seen in this clip, is possible thanks to the altitude difference. There's also the issue of radar lock breaking but Sparrow still scoring kills. Now, this one I'm not exactly sure why, but I believe it's the result of the Sparrow completing its lead before losing track, and the radar loses track in between the 1.5 seconds before the missile self-detonates, still scoring a kill against the target. That's just a theory, a game theory, but I don't really know the coding behind the missiles that would make it go pitball sometimes. A technique of radar and IR missiles is seeker slaving to radar. IR missiles that can uncage a seeker can rely on the radar to seek a target for it. Any target being tracked by the radar will be followed by the IR seeker until a lock is achieved. However, as guidance still relies on the IR seeker, IR missiles that are not all aspect capable cannot be fired head-on using radar slaving. I use it mostly when the missile has poor warm-up time and I can't keep maneuvering to keep the seeker on target. It's best to use it intermittently, as if the radar locks onto a friendly or unwanted target, the seeker might keep itself away from an intended target until the radar lock is broken and the seeker must reacquire the target. I was going to talk about beam riders in this section and how the MiG-21 PFM's KH-66 used to be a beam rider and you could use the radar to guide it like a facets RH missile. However, I guess they removed this capability and relegated the KH-66 as a SACLOS missile. And so far, there are no beam riders in-game mounted on aircraft with a tracking radar, so we won't ever get to test something like a Fire Streak with a tracking radar or AA-20 Nords with a tracking radar. There also exists a feature in many radars called SPI. If you hover over to the radar in the X-ray mode in the hangar, it will list down the capabilities and properties of radar, some of which, like in the F4E, have SPI. SPI stands for Sensor Point of Interest. In-game, it's used for CCRP bombing. Describing it is somewhat difficult, hence I'd rather just show how it works with this clip. Alright, here's the tutorial on how to use CCRP using the Sensor Point of Interest with your F4 Phantom. First, you need to configure the controls, activate target point, and deactivate target point. This is important because this is how you will set your bomb targets. Currently, you use the mouse, especially where the nose is pointing, to determine your impact point. So, how do we do it? We do it like this. We use these markers so we can determine what our impact point is. So, like this. So we're gonna target those. We're gonna target those vehicles over there. Yep. Then we're gonna click left click right mouse button. You can keep adjusting it as much as you want. Like that. Like that, yeah. Now you can level out, hit the drop bomb button. You can see that besides CCIP, RP is now included as well. So you see that bar and you see this little crosshair. When you press that, you can hold that so that when these two meet, you can drop the bombs. See, look at that. You will drop the bombs and it should hit where you pointed. Any minute now. There you go. That was a good hit. So that's how to use CCRP bombing. That means you can level out. You don't have to use the CCIP to point your nose at the enemy using a dive bomb and risk yourself to SPAA. While CCRP is less accurate, CCRP is safer than CCIP. So, yeah. Of course, as popular an installation radar has become on aircraft, there have been ways to counter it. The simplest countermeasure being chaff. Chaff are strips of reflective material, usually aluminum, that generate returns to the radar that presents itself as targets. In War Thunder, it works on all kinds of radar except velocity measurement pulse Doppler radars. In range measurement pulse Doppler radars like the EJ Kind J37C, chaff doesn't break lock, but the missile will go for the chaff like it's flares. The general idea for chaff is to drop them early, and if the RWR keeps pinging, go for the notch. Blindly chafing without consulting the RWR is an easy way to get shot down by radar missiles. Speaking of RWR, let's go to the radar warning receiver. While each RWR in-game uses the same interface, they all work differently. Early RWR only tracks radar locks in the four principal directions. RWR is basically, as it's named, a receiver that informs the pilot that a radar beam is tracking them. RWR is directional, meaning it helps the pilot identify where the track is coming from and allow them to perform the appropriate maneuvers. In my case, as the RWR pings, I drop chaff to determine if the lock is coming from a pulse Doppler radar or a non-pulse Doppler radar. A stop and ping means I successfully spoofed the track. Otherwise, I go for the notch. Thankfully, RWR is real-time, hence I can determine the proper angle when going for the notch. This would be the biggest drawback of the G35D. At 10.7, it's well within the range of radar missiles and pulse Doppler radars, and yet it neither has RWR nor chaff to defend against them. Before we go to notching, we go to terrain masking. Before pulse Dopplers were added, the F4E ruled the skies and forced MiG players to go low and slow to the ground, using ground clutter to counter the F4's radar. This technique should work against most aircraft below 11.3, but with the advent of all-aspect IR missiles and the climb meta slowly disappearing, terrain masking is slowly becoming moot, and notching becomes the last maneuver-based encounter against radar. Notching. Going back to the principle of pulse Doppler and Doppler shift, pulse Doppler processors can examine the Doppler shift of a target going perpendicular to the radar wave because the Doppler shift is constant throughout. This renders a target somewhat invisible to the radar. This also kills any missile tracking that was going on before the notch. Notching is perhaps the most effective way to counter pulse Doppler radars, as even velocity measurement pulse Dopplers are affected by it. Of course, if you don't want to do all that, you can simply fire an R60 at the radar missile and be done with it. Now that we're reaching the end of this lesson, we can finally summarize into concise points the plethora of information that has been dumped, and we can start by summarizing the pros and cons of each kind of radar system in War Thunder. We start with the non-pulse Doppler systems. Its biggest pro is that it can lock from any orientation. It's difficult to break lock through maneuvering, and it cannot be notched. The only way to defeat it is to chaff it, or to use terrain masking, which would be its biggest drawback. Up next is the velocity pulse Doppler radars. Their biggest pro is that they cannot be chaffed, and they can detect targets at up to the max radar range in game, and of course, look-down shoot-down capability. Their downsides are that they're very easy to notch, as the notch angles in the game are greatly exaggerated for balance. For range and measure pulse Dopplers, they are identical, except that the range measure pulse Dopplers can have the missile follow chaff. And finally, MTI radars. MTI radars act as like non-pulse Dopplers with look-down shoot-down in game. It can't be notched, it works at very low altitude, but it can be chaffed. After we've condensed the properties of each type of radar, we can finally condense this entire video into important points. The first being that current radars in game are reliant on the mechanical swinging of its antenna to track targets. Second is that radar has all kinds of uses, from bombing targets to guiding missiles. The radar has a hand in it. Third is that radar is a double-edged sword against RWR. You can track targets, but it can track you as well. Fourth is to strategize your use of the radar. Radar exposes you to RWR, especially when tracking at long distances. Using passive scan and only tracking when in proper range to fire a Fox 2 would greatly reduce your opponent's reaction time and gives a high probability of kill. And last but not least, listen to your RWR. Ignoring your RWR will harm your chances of survival, especially when facing agile radar missiles like the Skyflash and Dogfight E2 Sparrows. RWR was made extra annoying by Gaijin for a reason, and for that I really can't wait for Bitching Betty to get in-game. Radar is probably one of the most important tools I use in War Thunder. Flying the J7E without a search and track radar really shows you the night and day between aircraft with radar and aircraft without. Even if I don't use radar missiles on some radar-equipped aircraft like the MiG-21, the fact that it has a radar to detect enemies in this finicky spotting system helps a lot. IR slaving R60s has become a staple strategy for me as well, given that R67 offloads spool-up time, and having the seeker automatically orient itself to the target lowers my engagement time, and prevents me from tunnel visioning and dying to an enemy. When 4th generation aircraft arrive, bringing with them more radar features like track-well scan and multi-target track, radar is going to play an even bigger role in air RB matches, especially with the strong reliance of certain aircraft to Fox 3 missiles. When they arrive, top tier will finally hearken the quote-unquote death of the dogfight. Currently, we can still pretend that a semblance of dogfighting still exists at top tier, but when F-16s, MiG-29s, F-15s, and Sukhois start showing up, it'll just be ace combat through and through. Well, that's it for radars. I hope you at least picked something up from this long video. I wanted to be as comprehensive as possible when making this, as the length of the video speaks for itself. I plan to discuss missiles in the next video, and there we can go in depth with missile kinematics and topics about SAR-H missiles that had no place here. Thank you for watching. This is the Dr. MD. Godspeed.